September the 27th, 2025, the night sky above Lagos was strangely quiet. A city that never sleeps suddenly dimmed. From the coast to the desert edge, the lights of Africa's largest oil refinery, the pride of a nation, the heartbeat of its economy, went dark. No explosion, no malfunction, just silence and confusion. This was not a power outage. It was an order, a command from a powerful labor union that told thousands of workers to shut down the very machine that had promised to make Nigeria self-sufficient for the first time in its history. Now think about that. A refinery that pays its workers 3 to 4 times the national average. That pays billions in taxes. That was exporting refined fuel, yes, Nigerian fuel, to America and Europe for the first time ever. And yet someone wanted it dead. Why? That's the question that unlocks one of Africa's deepest wounds, because what happened in September 2025 wasn't about broken machines or angry workers. It was about a system, an old invisible web, that profits every time Africa fails to stand on its own feet. For 6 decades, Nigeria pumped crude oil and shipped it abroad only to buy it back as refined gasoline at 5 times the price. A cycle of dependence so absurd it became normal. Then one man, Aliko Dangote, decided to break that cycle with $20 billion of his own money. He built a dream the world said was impossible. But the moment he succeeded, the system struck back. So tonight we're going to uncover what really happened the night the refinery went dark and why every African nation trying to rise must fight not just poverty or corruption, but something far older, institutional capture, where the protectors of progress become its destroyers. Stay until the end. Because what you'll see in Nigeria's darkness might just reveal why Africa's brightest lights keep burning out. Please share if you believe Africa deserves to build without permission. Subscribe if you think the truth is more important than the headlines. For 60 long years, Nigeria's wealth has flowed in one direction out. Oil, the black blood beneath its soil, has been pumped, shipped, and sold to foreign refineries since the 1960s. Then, like a cruel joke, the same fuel returns home 5 times more expensive to power the very trucks and generators that keep the nation alive. It's a story older than independence itself, a story of dependency disguised as trade. Imagine growing cocoa in your backyard, sending it to Europe, and then buying back chocolate bars wrapped in gold paper. That's been Nigeria's economic loop for generations, rich in resources, poor in returns. And then came one man who decided to break the cycle. Aliko Dangote, a name that carries both admiration and resentment. The son of Kano, a self-made billionaire who built an empire from cement, sugar, and salt. When he announced his plan to construct Africa's largest oil refinery, many laughed. Others whispered that he was playing with fire. $20 billion. That's what it took. Not public money, not international aid, but a personal gamble so vast that Dangote mortgaged his entire industrial empire to make it happen. He wanted Nigeria to refine its own oil, to stop kneeling before the middlemen of the global energy market. At full capacity, the Dangote Refinery can process 650,000 barrels of crude oil every single day. It produces gasoline that meets even the strict U.S. environmental standards, among the toughest in the world. Within 3 weeks of operation, it did what no government refinery had ever done in half a century: export refined fuel to America. For a moment, hope returned. For the first time in living memory, Nigerians watched tankers leaving their shores not with crude oil, but with finished high-value products. It felt like the beginning of a new era, a small victory against a long history of exploitation. But that celebration didn't last. Almost immediately, the cracks began to show. Despite sitting on one of the largest oil reserves on the continent, the Dangote Refinery was running short on crude. The irony was breathtaking. Nigeria, a nation swimming in oil, couldn't supply its own refinery. Why? Because the oil producers, most of them licensed by the state, refused to sell directly. Instead, they forced Dangote to buy through international middlemen in US dollars at inflated prices. The Nigerian government owned the oil. The refinery was built for Nigerians, and yet to get access to its own national resource, it had to pay outsiders first. It was a scheme so twisted, it bordered on absurdity. Every extra layer of middlemen meant more profit for the few and more pressure on the one man trying to simplify the system. The message was clear: anyone who threatens the chain of dependence will be made to pay for it. Still, Dangote persisted. He reorganized, hired new engineers, and adjusted supply chains. He spoke little, smiled often, and worked relentlessly to keep the dream alive. But in the shadows, resistance was already building. Old networks, the ones that thrived on inefficiency, on fees, on delays, began to stir. From oil depots to trucking unions, whispers spread that the new refinery would change everything, and that to them was not good news, because Dangote's success didn't just challenge economic models, it threatened power. It exposed how much of Nigeria's wealth flowed through invisible toll gates, the countless hands that collect a share of every barrel, every truck, every liter of fuel sold. What began as a symbol of hope was now surrounded by enemies who smiled in daylight and plotted at night. And on one quiet September morning, they would finally make their move. It began quietly. Rumors whispered through the refinery corridors. There are saboteurs inside. Pipes were found deliberately left open, machinery tampered with, shipments delayed. To most, it looked like random errors. To Aliko Dangote, it smelled like orchestration. So, on a humid September morning, he made a decision no CEO wants to make. 800 workers were let go, not fired in rage, but reassigned across his other companies. He said it was necessary to protect the refinery's integrity. And that's when the real storm began. Within days, a powerful labor union, Pengasan, the Petroleum and Natural Gas Senior Staff Association of Nigeria, arrived at the refinery gates with membership forms and megaphones. They demanded that Dangote's workers join their ranks, citing labor rights and constitutional freedoms. They claimed the billionaire had replaced local staff with foreign engineers, mostly Indians, and that he was violating Nigerian labor law. On the surface, it sounded noble. Workers organizing for fairness, a story as old as industry itself. But something didn't add up. Across Nigeria, there are tens of thousands of gas station attendants earning $60 a month, half the minimum wage. Pengasan never fights for them. There are truck drivers making $160 a month, hauling dangerous cargo for multinational oil companies. The union never strikes for them either. But suddenly, the best-paid oil workers in the nation, those earning 3 to 4 times the industry average, became the top priority. Why follow the money? For decades, Nigeria's oil distribution ran through a network of depots and middlemen. Every truck that moved fuel paid a fee about 50,000 naira per trip, roughly $32. Multiply that by thousands of trucks daily, and you get a silent river of money flowing into union coffers and the pockets of depot owners. But Dangote had broken that system. He invested $250 million in 4,000 modern compressed natural gas CNG trucks, each employing 6 Nigerians. These trucks went directly from refinery to gas stations, bypassing the depots entirely. No depots, no middlemen, no union fees. It was innovation, but to those who had feasted on inefficiency, it was heresy. And so the union retaliated. On September 27, 2025, Pengasan ordered its members to shut off all gas and crude supply to the Dangote Refinery, not to negotiate, not to protest, but to paralyze. Overnight, 44 million liters of daily gasoline output vanished. The consequences were immediate. Across Lagos, gas stations ran dry. Long queues returned for the first time in years. Hospitals began rationing power. Generators sputtered out. Flights were delayed. Nigeria, a nation of 230 million people, stared into the abyss of another fuel crisis. The law was clear: energy supply is classified as an essential service. Unions are required to give 15 days' notice, seek mediation, and obtain court approval before any strike. Pengasan ignored all of it. They shut the valves, defied the courts, and dared the government to stop them. When the National Industrial Court issued an injunction, the union laughed it off. Even as judges read their orders, the pumps stayed silent. For many Nigerians, it was a moment of déjà vu, the same old cycle of chaos disguised as justice. But this time it hit harder because the refinery had represented something sacred, the idea that Africa could finally produce, refine, and export on its own terms. Inside the refinery, Dangote's team watched helplessly as gauges fell to zero, pipelines cooled, and the lights faded. Some cried, others cursed. Dangote himself said little. Those close to him recall him standing by a window whispering, "They're not fighting me. They're fighting the idea that Africa can stand alone." The next day, television pundits called it a labor dispute. Newspapers framed it as a clash between capital and rights. But to those who understood the system, it was much darker. This wasn't about wages. It was about control. And for the first time in a long time, the parasites of progress were no longer hiding. They had stepped into the light proud, confident, and unafraid. When the refinery went dark, the entire nation felt the tremor. At first, people thought it was just another short-term labor protest, the kind that ends with a handshake and a press release. But as hours turned into days, it became clear that this was different. The silence from Dangote's refinery wasn't just mechanical, it was political. Hospitals began rationing power. Emergency rooms went dark for hours at a time. In Lagos, cars snaked for miles outside empty gas stations. In the north, food deliveries slowed. Every generator, every taxi, every farmer waiting for diesel, all of them were held hostage by a single decision from a single union. And as chaos spread, one question echoed across radio stations and living rooms: who really runs Nigeria, the government or the middlemen? The National Industrial Court finally intervened, issuing an injunction declaring the strike illegal. The law was unambiguous. Essential services like energy could not be shut down without a 15-day notice or mediation process. Yet Pengassan ignored the order, as if daring the judiciary to enforce its own authority. For a few tense days, the government hesitated. Ministers called for calm. Regulators blamed miscommunication. Behind closed doors, negotiators shuttled between Dangote's offices and the union's headquarters. No one wanted to be the one to pull the trigger, not against the most powerful union in the country and not against its richest citizen. Eventually, a deal was reached. The 800 dismissed workers would be redeployed across Dangote's other companies. No one would lose their job. The union would call off the strike. The refinery would restart. Crisis averted, or so it seemed. Because beneath the smiling photographs and official statements, nothing fundamental had changed. Dangote still couldn't buy Nigerian crude directly. He still had to pay middlemen in US dollars to access oil that technically belonged to his own country. The depot owners still controlled distribution networks. The union still had unchecked power to halt national energy supply. And the regulator astonishingly still operated without a functional laboratory to test fuel quality. Worse yet, that same regulator, the one lacking basic testing equipment, publicly accused Dangote's products of failing sulfur standards. Independent tests later proved the refinery's fuel exceeded global quality benchmarks. But the damage was already done. Import licenses were quietly approved for competitors to bring in cheap substandard fuel from abroad. Fuel that truly violated those same sulfur standards. The hypocrisy was staggering and deliberate. It wasn't about protecting consumers. It was about protecting the rent-seekers. To the average Nigerian, the message was clear. If you try to change the system will remind you who's in charge. The political class, terrified of losing alliances with unions and depot owners, tiptoed around the issue. No one wanted to confront the structure of corruption that had fed so many for so long. Television anchors called Dangote too ambitious. Lawmakers warned of monopolies. But few dared to ask the obvious: how can one be a monopolist in a country where 31 other refinery licenses lie unused? That's when the refinery story stopped being about oil and became a mirror of African politics itself. It showed how easily progress can be strangled by those meant to protect it. How democracy, courts, and unions can be captured not by ideology, but by greed. And it revealed a truth too uncomfortable for politicians to admit. In Nigeria and across much of Africa, the greatest threat to sovereignty doesn't come from abroad. It comes from within. From Washington to Brussels, few headlines mentioned the refinery shutdown. It was treated as a local labor dispute, a minor hiccup in an oil-producing nation. But for those who've watched Africa's rise and stumble for decades, this silence spoke volumes. Because what happened in Nigeria is not an isolated story, it's a pattern. Every time an African nation tries to build something that reduces dependence, the system pushes back. It doesn't always look like coups or sanctions. Sometimes it hides behind institutions that sound noble: labor rights groups, environmental regulators, or anti-monopoly commissions, all claiming to protect fairness, while in reality protecting control. You've seen this playbook before. In Ethiopia, when the government built the Grand Renaissance Dam, the largest in Africa, Western institutions warned of environmental risks. Funding was cut, loans delayed, lawsuits filed. In Ghana, when the state attempted to stabilize its currency by bypassing the IMF, it was accused of market interference. In Kenya, when citizens protested foreign-controlled infrastructure deals, they were labeled instigators of instability. And now, in Nigeria, the moment a privately built refinery threatened decades of profitable dependency, a union suddenly became the instrument of paralysis. From a distance, it looks democratic people exercising their rights. But look closer, and you'll see a pattern of institutional capture when watchdogs stop serving the public and start serving the invisible empire of middlemen, lobbyists, and foreign interests. Let's be honest, for much of the developed world, Africa's dysfunction has been profitable. When Nigeria exports crude but imports refined fuel, Western refineries stay busy. When Congo exports cobalt but imports batteries, European factories keep humming. Dependency is the world's quietest business model and Africa's greatest curse. But something has begun to shift. Across the Sahel, a new generation of leaders, Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso, Assimi Goïta in Mali, Abdourahmane Tiani in Niger, have begun saying no, not with bitterness, but with clarity. They've started nationalizing resources, auditing contracts, and building regional self-reliance under the Alliance of Sahel States AES. It's the same logic Dangote applied in Nigeria: cut out the middleman, reclaim the process. And that is exactly why both political and economic systems react with hostility. To many in the West, this movement feels threatening, but to many Africans, it feels liberating. It's not anti-American nor anti-European. It's pro-dignity. It's the idea that Africans should no longer need permission to build, to refine, or to dream. For older Americans who remember the oil shocks of the 1970s or the collapse of Detroit's auto factories, this story may sound familiar. It's what happens when power shifts, when production moves closer to the people who own the raw material. The world resists change because someone's profit depends on your weakness. So when Nigeria's refinery went dark, it wasn't just a national crisis. It was a warning to every reformer, every innovator, every continent trying to stand on its own. Build your independence, and the old empire will use your own institutions to stop you. And that is the real lesson, not just for Africa, but for America too. Because once institutions forget who they serve, freedom becomes a slogan instead of a reality. When the refinery lights flickered back on, the cameras returned. The news anchors smiled. The government congratulated itself. Crisis averted, they said. But beneath that fragile calm, something fundamental remained broken. Because this story was never about pipes or petrol. It was about power: who has it, who abuses it, and who dares to take it back. Africa's tragedy has never been a lack of talent or courage. It has been the quiet suffocation of progress by those who profit from its failure. From colonial administrators to modern middlemen, from foreign regulators to local unions, the faces have changed, but the strategy remains the same: keep Africa dependent, one broken institution at a time. Dangote survived because he had billions and the will to fight. But what about the young engineer with a dream of building solar panels in Burkina Faso? Or the woman in Ghana who wants to open a pharmaceutical plant? They don't have the money or protection to withstand the system's backlash, and so the ideas die before they're born. That's how nations are drained, not by invasion, but by exhaustion. There is an old Yoruba proverb that says, "The hand of the child cannot reach the shelf, and the hand of the elder cannot enter the gourd." It means that every generation must do its part, the elders must make space, and the young must reach higher. But in today's Africa, the elders still cling to the shelf, blocking the young from even seeing what's inside the gourd. And yet, a change is coming. Across the continent, from Ouagadougou to Lagos, from Bamako to Accra, people are beginning to see the pattern for what it is. Leaders like President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso are refusing to play the old game. He's teaching an entire generation that sovereignty isn't declared in speeches, it's built in factories, schools, and refineries. So as you listen to this story, wherever you are in America or abroad, remember this: the fight for Africa's independence is not over. It has simply changed its form. The chains are no longer made of iron, but of policies, prices, and permissions. The question now is simple: who will have the courage to break them? Will the next generation of African leaders stand as tall as Ibrahim Traoré? Or will they bend under the weight of the same old empires wearing new faces? If you believe Africa deserves the right to build without permission, share this video. If you believe truth matters more than the headlines, subscribe and stand with those who still dare to dream, because the refinery may have gone dark once, but Africa's fire is still burning.